Well, it is 5:31 in California and 8:31 on the East Coast. So let's get started. I would expect that we'll have a number of additional members and guests joining us today. But good evening to everyone in the United States, and good morning to all of our friends and colleagues in China. And I am just delighted to welcome you to MACROChina. We look forward to bringing you regular updates on the major developments in China's macroeconomy. Before we get started on today's discussion, I'd like to remind everyone that gala sponsorships are still available at the leadership, benefactor, and patron levels for members and qualified member prospects. Please see the details in the chat box. Moving on to today's program, I'm delighted to be joined by an old friend and colleague, Andy Rothman. Andy Rothman is an investment strategist at Matthews Asia. He is principally responsible for developing research focused on China's ongoing economic and political developments, while also complementing the broader investment team with in-depth analysis on Asia. In addition, Andy plays a key role in communicating to clients and to the media the firm's perspectives and latest insights into China and the greater Asian region. So prior to joining Matthews Asia in 2014, Andy spent 14 years as CLSA's China macroeconomic strategist, where he conducted analysis into China and delivered his insights to clients. Prior to that, Andy spent 17 years in the U.S. Foreign Service with a diplomatic career focused on China, including as head of the macroeconomics and domestic policy office at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. In total, Andy has lived in China for more than 20 years. He earned his MA in public administration from the LBJ School of Public Affairs in Texas and a BA from Colgate University. I want to make sure that everyone is aware that today's event will be publicly available after the fact via our YouTube channel. We want to spread the insights from these events widely, and we also want to encourage a robust discussion. So to find that balance over the course of the next hour, if you have questions for Andy, I would urge you to put them in the Q&A box, and then I will submit them to Andy anonymously. But we very much welcome your questions and encourage your participation through the Q&A. But please remember, this will become a public recording, and therefore we want you to be protected and use the Q&A. As we work to make some of our analysis public, we'd encourage you to share this with friends and colleagues who might not be USCBC members. And as always, we welcome your feedback on how we can make USCBC events and programs a better resource for your company. So audience participation is very welcome. We want your active engagement. And if there's anything that you want to know about the Chinese macro economy, even if Andy didn't cover it, I'm sure that he'd be happy to respond to that if you put it into the Q&A. So if I may ask Andy to kick it off with some preliminary comments, and I believe that you have a presentation. Andy, over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Craig. Great to be here with everybody and appreciate the opportunity with the council. I've benefited a lot from the council's advocacy and research over 30 plus years, dating back to when I was in the State Department. So and I've enjoyed the sessions that I've done with you folks in Beijing and Shanghai and Washington over the years. So great to join you via this platform as well. So I'll make some opening remarks, and then we'll have lots more time for conversation. What I want to do today is focus on what I think are the two most important, most interesting questions for everybody who's following China, doing business in China, investing in China. And those questions are, first, will Xi Jinping become more pragmatic in dealing with COVID and the Chinese economy? And the second question is, will Joe Biden become more pragmatic and constructive in dealing with China? But before I give my thoughts on those two questions, I want to start with a third question. And that is, does Xi Jinping deserve a third term? Now, he's had a couple of rough quarters recently. And for those of us in the investment world, we like to think that people look at our track records over a longer period of time. And I think that his peers in the party are doing that. So while it's been a rough couple of quarters, over the last 10 years that he's been head of the party, his numbers are pretty good. Average annual real inflation adjusted income growth of 7% versus 2% in the US and the UK. Average annual real retail sales growth of 8% versus 3% in the US and 1% in the UK. An average annual contribution to global economic growth of 32% to global growth every year on average over the last decade versus 11% of growth for the US and 3% for the UK. And a lot of numbers have improved. For example, China's share of global exports rose during Xi Jinping's time from 11% to a 15% share last year, while in the US and the UK, their shares both fell a little bit, 8% for the US and 2% for the UK. I think Xi Jinping's numbers also are pretty good on the domestic rebalancing side. Last year was the 10th consecutive year in which the tertiary part of China's GDP, the consumer and services part, was the largest part. This is now really a domestic demand-driven economy, just like ours. The private company share of employment, while Xi Jinping's been head of the party, rose from 82% to 88%. And the private company share of China's exports is now 60%, up from 38% when Xi Jinping took over. So on that basis, he's almost certainly going to get a third 5-year term next month at the 20th Party Congress. So now let's go to those two questions that I listed before, and let's start with really the most important one. Will Xi Jinping return to pragmatism? And this is important because it's pragmatism that has made China rich, kept the party in power, and enabled all of us to do business in China. Certainly, when I first started working in China in 1984 as a very junior American diplomat, if you'd asked me, would I now be working for an investment firm that focused on helping Americans invest in publicly traded Chinese companies, I would have said, there's no chance that that would happen. So it's really been quite remarkable over the last few decades, including under Xi Jinping, as I've just outlined. They've made a lot of mistakes under Xi and under the previous regimes, but they have typically course corrected. Let me give you a couple of examples recently. About a year ago, the media was full of headlines about power shortages in China. You might remember back then, a lot of the pundits were saying this was an indication that the Chinese manufacturing economy was going to collapse because there wasn't enough power. You haven't heard about that because they course corrected quite quickly. On the tech side, the rollout of common prosperity and the regulations related to the tech sector last year were disastrous. But I think it was because of really poorly thought out, chaotic implementation designed to achieve admirable objectives. I think the focus was not on rolling back the market-based economy or rolling back private firms. Instead, I think it was about dealing with some of the same socioeconomic political issues that we're worried about here. Income inequality, unequal wealth, unequal access to education and healthcare and housing, and also some anti-competitive practices by some larger firms, particularly in the tech space. But they rolled it out in a horrible way. But since that time, they've made a lot of statements about that, recognizing that they rolled it out poorly and that they were going to implement it in a much better way this year. But we haven't really been able to test that yet because of the way zero COVID has been implemented since Omicron came to China. And this is really, I think, the primary reason that the Chinese economy is struggling right now. And I think the most important step that has to be taken to get the Chinese economy back on track is better implementation of COVID mitigation policies. Now, Meg, if you could put the first slide up. One of the things I want to start by talking about is that these are not irrational policies that the Chinese government has put in place, although that's the way it's often described in the media. From a public health perspective, zero COVID has been really successful. very few people have died in China. This data is just for the last few months, but illustrates that at peak Omicron, China's been really successful at keeping people from dying. If China were to open up based on these numbers, the way that other countries have opened up, they would be expected to have about 2,000 COVID deaths per day. Right now, they're running at 0. And on the next slide, I want to take a step back and say that prior to Omicron arriving, zero COVID was also pretty successful from an economic perspective. What you can see on this chart here is compared to 2019 before COVID, last year, the consumer part of China's economy, the biggest part, bounced back more strongly than the consumer parts of the US and Eurozone economies. And then on the next slide, you can see that also zero COVID allowed China to continue to play a key role in global supply chains. Last year, despite COVID, despite the tariffs in the United States, China's share of global exports hit an all-time high. And then the next slide illustrates that another key part of China's economic development continued under zero COVID last year. And that's the rebalancing that we've all been looking for. So last year, this red line highlights, was the 10th consecutive year in which the tertiary part of China's GDP, the consumer and services part, was the biggest part. So this is not your grandfather's China economy anymore. It's not driven by exports. In fact, in the 5 years up until COVID in 2019, net exports, that's the value of a country's exports minus their imports, net exports on average every year back then contributed 0 to China's GDP growth. Consumption is bigger than manufacturing as well, as you can see here. So up until Omicron arrived, things were pretty successful. And we can drop the slides now, Meg. But fear of continuing lockdowns has been stopping families from spending as much as they would have. And fear of further lockdowns has stopped companies from hiring and spending. The economy is slowing down significantly. And this path is clearly unsustainable, even though it's been successful in preventing deaths. Now, as I said, I understand the dilemma that the Chinese leadership is under. Opening up the way many other countries have opened up could lead to 2,000 deaths a day. But the current path, as I said, is unsustainable. So I'm betting on a return to pragmatism, a more pragmatic balance between public health and the economy and social concerns in China after next month's Party Congress. Now, I'm betting on a pragmatic approach to things like a much stronger push on vaccinating elderly Chinese people. China has about 30 million people over the age of 80. That's equal to the entire population of Texas. And most of them don't have the 3 jabs of the Chinese vaccine that's necessary to provide good protection. From an economic and business perspective, an investment perspective, the most important thing is China has to dispense with lockdowns. Even though we haven't seen the dramatic full lockdowns that Shanghai went under since that time, the partial lockdowns have been enough to completely disrupt the Chinese economy. That has to change. And again, I'm betting on China returning to pragmatism, but I also have to acknowledge that there's no clear roadmap from Xi Jinping or the leadership to tell us that this is where they're going to go. In fact, they've been surprisingly quiet about this. But I'm encouraged from a few things that have happened recently. For example, you're all probably familiar with a few weeks ago, there was an agreement between the Chinese government and the US government, between the CSRC, the stock market regulator in China, and the PCAOB in the United States, the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. This is an agreement to avoid the forced delisting of over 200 Chinese companies that trade on US exchanges. Now, this was a dispute that was running for about a decade. And the fact that it was resolved during this period of significant tension between Washington and Beijing, that it was resolved prior to the Party Congress, to me sends a message that Xi Jinping both wants to avoid financial decoupling and that he's also, I think, sending a signal that he'd like to stabilize the relationship, the political relationship with the United States. It's also a positive sign, I think, that Xi Jinping is in Central Asia now, his first trip abroad since COVID. He's been in Kazakhstan, is heading to Uzbekistan. He's planning to go to Indonesia for the G20, where hopefully he's going to meet with President Biden in November. This is a big change. I think one of the reasons that he hasn't been traveling is this concern about, he travels with a big entourage like Biden does. What do they all do when they go back to Beijing? Is all the senior leadership of the Chinese government going to quarantine for a week? We're going to get a lot more visibility into how they're thinking about this, I think, when Xi and his party return to Beijing from Uzbekistan, because they're going into the run-up to the party Congress. It's impossible for me to imagine they're going to lock everybody up at home or in a government quarantine facility during this period. That may give us a sense of how they're going to deal with COVID more broadly after the party Congress. And finally, pragmatism has been the key, in my view, that's kept the Communist Party in power all this time. So I think the odds are strong that they're going to return to a more pragmatic approach. I'm less optimistic about my second question, which is, will Washington return to a more pragmatic approach to China? In my view, and I'd love to hear what you all in the audience think about this, in my view, Joe Biden is now treating China as an enemy, and that the US is destined for conflict with China, especially over Taiwan. The Biden administration seems to see competition with China as a zero-sum game. If China gets richer, by definition, the US must be getting poorer. If China advances in biotech, in AI, in semiconductors, the US must be regressing. President Biden seems to want US allies and partners around the world, especially in Asia, to choose sides, even though the administration says that's not what they're doing. To me, that's what they're doing. And I think that's how our allies and partners in the region are seeing it as well. And in my view, all of this is counterproductive for the US and for the world. China is not going away. The idea of assuming that we have to be in conflict with China is just irrational to me and incredibly dangerous. Instead, we need to be focusing on trying to put this relationship back on a more constructive path. And I don't see that happening. And I'm pessimistic in that I don't see much chance that that's going to change between now and 2024. Hopefully, by that point, it will be clear that this path is not productive, isn't working, and that'll be an opportunity to change course. But before I wrap up and turn it back over to Craig, I want to highlight a couple of things on this. Most importantly, this political tension should, in my view, have a very limited impact on the Chinese economy. Because as I mentioned before, this Chinese economy today is a domestic demand-driven economy. So the impact on tariffs, for example, we just don't hear the Chinese government complaining about it because it really hasn't hurt them. Exports to the US have fallen off a little bit, but they picked that up in other markets. And as I mentioned before, China's share of global exports reached an all-time high last year. This is now a domestic demand economy, and it should continue to thrive despite these political tensions. And then if you're looking at investing in China, the way Matthews Asia does where I work, we're very much an active investor as opposed to an index-based passive investor, because it's really important to think about which Chinese companies are going to come under the scrutiny of the Biden administration and what is almost certain to be a continuing escalation use of sanctions and entities lists and blacklists and things like that. So Craig, let me stop there and turn it over to you, and I look forward to talking about some of these things.
Okay, Andy, what a fantastic set of opening remarks. Sobering, but encouraging on the economic side as well. So we have a number of questions coming in over the Q&A, and I would request that people please ask away. Andy, I wanted to kind of to ask you a little bit more to speak about what you think the Chinese economy would look like today if it were not for Omicron and the quarantines, the shutdowns. My impression was that there are a lot of problems, structural problems building up. So where would we be absent Omicron or absent COVID-19?
Yeah, I think we would probably be close to where we were last year. It's certainly not an economy without trouble, but that's always been the case. Every economy faces those kinds of difficulties. And I think one of the hallmarks of China has been that they make a lot of mistakes on the government side, but then they tend to course correct. And I would describe this as a bug in the Leninist system. There's no opposition party to force debate. There's no free press to air plans and gather information and challenge and question what's happening. Instead, the government tends to roll out plans that are often not well thought out. Go back to the tech regulations from last year associated with common prosperity. Again, as I said before, I think the goals there were admirable, but just really poorly thought out and coordinated, as the government itself has admitted. Or look at the power shortages. That came from terrible coordination for admirable objectives. Again, there was the desire to reduce coal mine accidents, reduce corruption in the coal industry, and increase efficiency in electric generation. But they did too much too quickly at a time when demand was spiking and weather was creating problems for hydro and wind power. But they course corrected. And so what we haven't seen recently is a course correction on COVID. And of course, another area that we might want to talk about in more detail is the property market, which is a really big part of the economy. And it's in serious trouble now. But I think it's mostly in serious trouble because the course correction that they've been trying to make after a mistaken policy initiative last year has been blocked from being effective because of zero COVID. Who wants to buy a new apartment if you don't know whether there are going to be more lockdowns, what your income's going to be like, what your business is going to be like? So I think without the zero COVID policy, the way it's being implemented now, the economy would be in pretty healthy state right now.
So you don't think that they would have the 20% youth unemployment problem or the real estate problem, or that they would be more manageable?
Yeah, so I would separate out those two. I think the 20% youth unemployment, and by the way, I would suggest that the formal number is 19.9% because I think that nobody wanted to publish 20%. Publishing an unemployment statistic that high to me indicates that the real number must be much higher than that. Now, we have to acknowledge that every year at this time, youth unemployment spikes. You get 8 million or so graduates coming out of the university system. The number of new jobs that those people feel are an appropriate match for their skills has been lagging behind because there's been a 40% increase in college graduation numbers over Xi Jinping's term. But 20% is crazy. And I think a lot of that is because zero COVID has led firms to cut back on jobs and cut back on investment. And so, yeah, I think that's the biggest problem there. Property is a different issue. Please.
Yeah, let's talk, please, on property. I want to hear your views.
Okay, so I'll start by saying that I have long been pretty positive and upbeat on the residential property sector in China. To me, it's a very healthy part of the Chinese economy for a couple of important reasons. One is that the vast majority of new homes in China are sold to owner-occupiers. When I was on the sell side for a brokerage firm in China, we set up a research firm to do on-the-ground research independent from the government. And this business is still operating. And one of the things that they do every month for about 15 years now is poll realtors around the country. And one of the questions they ask is, for the people who bought a flat from you this month, were they owner-occupiers or were they investors, speculators? And that has changed quite a bit over the last 15 years or so. Back then, it was 80% owner-occupiers buying. Now it's 90%. I actually think this is too small a share of investors because it means there's not enough rental units out there. But this is not a speculative-driven market. And the other important element is money, cash. So think about what went wrong in the US property market about a decade ago when we had our crisis here. I think it's all summed up with one statistic. In 2006, just ahead of the crisis, the median cash down payment for a new home in the United States, the median was 2% of the purchase price. And of course, you had no doc loans and ninja loans and balloon option arms. In China, the legal minimum for buying a new home, if you're going to live in it, is 20%. But if you look at mortgages on bank balance sheets right now, the average is 30% cash down. And it's all plain vanilla lending. And if you're going to buy as an investor, it's really hard to get a mortgage and you have to put at least 60% cash down. So those things to me make this a really healthy story. So what's happened is that the leadership in China has a lot of levers to pull, policy levers, and they just can't keep their hands off those levers. So what they're facing is not a bubble, because in my mind, bubbles are all about leverage, and leverage among homeowners is low. What they're facing is the same problem that's being faced in the communities where you and I are today in Northern California, right? Such a large part of the population here is priced out of the market. It's the same thing in New York and the same thing in London. It's a social and political problem that house prices are out of line are unreachable for most people. But for the people who can afford to buy them, they're fine. So the government intervenes, and they intervened a couple of years ago. They cut back on bank credit available to developers, but then the real problem came last May. New home sales were growing 39% year over year in the first 5 months of last year, and the government freaked out about that. So they called all the banks and said, stop issuing mortgages. New home sales for the rest of the year fell 14%. So developers couldn't raise money. No one could buy. So that's the problem. Now, the government acknowledged at the end of last year they overreacted. They course corrected. Mortgages are now readily available. They've cut mortgage interest rates just this year by over 100 basis points. Contrast that with what's happening here. But hardly anybody's buying because of COVID. And then you compound that with this mortgage protest problem. This is really interesting. This is people protesting in China, which is great to see. One thing that's important to note is that as far as we can determine, nobody has yet stopped paying their mortgage. These are people who are threatening to stop paying their mortgage because they want the government to step in. Also, these are not people who are saying they can't afford their mortgage. These are people saying, I can afford my mortgage. I bought a house. I just want the damn place to be delivered on time, because as most of you know, almost all the new apartments in China are sold on a pre-sale basis. So people end up putting their 30% cash down, taking out a mortgage, starting to service it when the project's only about 1/3 underway. And now you've got developers who can't sell any more flats. So in projects where they'd only sold part of the units before Omicron lockdowns, they're kind of stuck right now. And the government has said they're going to fix this. And my view is if they get Omicron policy right, then that will be a relatively easy thing to fix, because relative to the size of the housing market and the mortgage market, it's small. We estimate it's 2%. The mortgages under protest are about 2% of outstanding mortgages right now. So these things can be fixed. And I see an analog to 2014, when the government went crazy pulling those policy levers, crashed the property market, reversed course, and in 2015 and 2016, the property market was booming.
So, Andy, I hope you're right, but I'm very worried about local government finance and local government's relationships with the developers, and that many of these regions are going to be stuck with an overhang of supply with insufficient demand in real estate for a long time. You don't share those worries.
Yeah, I think that there are definitely oversupply problems right now, but I think this is a temporary factor because there's hardly been any sales in the last 4 quarters. For me, the best metric for understanding the supply-demand balance in China for housing is the price, because we don't have inventory data that is reliable. And if you look at prices, it's weak right now. The average new home price in China as of July was down 6% year over year. But for the overwhelming majority of homeowners, prices are up. They're up 2% compared to 2 years ago. They're up 32% compared to 5 years ago. They're up 81% compared to 10 years ago. So that data tells me that there can't be millions of vacant, unsold apartments, because this is a market-based transaction. Why would any Chinese family agree to buy a flat with prices rising that much if they know that there's a lot of unsold inventory hanging out there, right? Market forces would push prices down. And up until this year, that hasn't happened. Now, I also share your concern about local government finances. There are a lot of poorly run local governments. There's been a lot of bad decisions made. But for me, we have to remember one thing here, is that There are no local governments in China the way we think about local governments in the United States. Here, local governments and state governments are separate from the federal government. We all understand that. In China, that's not the case. Local governments are effectively branch offices of the Communist Party in Beijing. Even the mayors, the party secretaries are all people who are appointed by the Communist Party. And it is standard practice every year at the National People's Congress in March. The finance ministry publishes its budget report and says how much debt local governments are in. And then the next line is, we will issue bonds and make up that difference. So this is a problem, but it's a national problem. And you're not going to see a default like, let's say, Washington State or New York City many years ago. It will result in a lower ability to fund a stimulus, let's say, but we're not going to see bankruptcies in local governments.
Oh, interesting. Okay, let's go back to COVID. We have some great questions here. One is that recommending that the Chinese government adopt mRNA vaccines. Do you expect that will happen as the Chinese government rolls out their pragmatic approach after the 20th Party Congress? And if so, about how long, what would be the economic consequences of a rollout, and how long would that take?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one of the great tragedies that the Chinese government made this really poorly thought out decision not to approve for use in China the Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna mRNA vaccines. As many of you know, I'm sure one of the large Chinese pharmaceutical companies has been licensed to distribute and eventually to produce these vaccines, and they've been selling them in Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan, but not on the mainland. And that's really a tragedy because it's clear that the Chinese vaccines are less effective. And it's surprising because in the past, the Chinese government has allowed foreign vaccines in. Merck has been selling for 4 or 5 years its HPV vaccine, which is very popular in China. So it's really unfortunate, but my return to pragmatism hope does not include in the near term that the Chinese government's going to reverse course and allow the foreign mRNA vaccines in. Hopefully, before too long, Chinese companies will have their own mRNA vaccines, but I think that at this point, we just have to accept that that's probably not going to change, and that what they're going to have to do is just focus on getting more jabs in the arms of older people. And if you look at a study that was done earlier this year by Hong Kong University and the WHO, they found in Hong Kong that 3 jabs of the Chinese vaccines provide 98% effectiveness in preventing death among older people, which is equal to Pfizer. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean these people won't go into hospital, which will be a real problem for China. But that is something that they can work on, but they really just have to get a lot more elderly people in China vaccinated. Otherwise, they run the risk of a significant increase in deaths.
Yeah, and economic slowdown as well.
Yeah, as I said, they really must change this approach to COVID in the coming few quarters. Otherwise, they're going to dig themselves a really deep hole economically.
So what sort of a rebound would you expect economically if in, say, by the end of 2022, the Chinese are opening up again? And for this year, I think that the Chinese government is estimating 3.5% to 4% economic growth. Would you concur with that? And what would you look at for 2023?
Yeah, well, first of all, I have over a decade ago stopped trying to forecast the GDP growth rate because it's the least accurate statistic in China. It's the most manipulated statistic within a pretty narrow range. But it's also, I think, for most of us, the least important statistic. So I'm much more focused on data that I have a higher degree of confidence in, and that I think are more important for businesses and certainly for investors in Chinese equities. That's things like income growth, inflation, jobs, retail sales, and we have a higher degree of confidence in those numbers because we can double check them. So I won't give you a GDP forecast, but what I do think we have to be pragmatic in what a recovery is going to look like, which is going to be gradual. The Chinese government is not going to do the world's biggest fiscal stimulus again like they did during the last crisis because they don't need to. So I think they'll be comfortable, and I think I'll be comfortable as an investor as long as the trend is moving in the right direction. And we're also, I think, not going to see a single speech by, say, Xi Jinping at the Party Congress or after that lays out in the kind of clarity that we'd like, here's how our COVID policy is going to change. It's going to be rolled out gradually. And I think it will take a few months for people and for companies in China to accept, to be comfortable with the fact that lockdowns are a thing of the past. And then spending will slowly, steadily go back to normal. So I don't think you'll see a full recovery probably until next year.
Yeah, that's a good, cautious way to look at it. Andy, from one of our anonymous attendees, we have two questions. How do you see China's industrial and tech policy? How is the international cooperation impacted by the U.S. sanctions and China's search for self-reliance? And how do you see China will be impacted by restructuring of the global supply chain? Big questions, but good questions, and good to push ourselves here. Please.
Yeah. So let me start to answer that by saying, at this point, I think there's been a lot of talk about deglobalization and reducing China's role in global supply chains, but I think it's largely been talk. For sure, some of your member companies have changed some of their production facilities, but I think that has been largely a continuation of the gradual change in the manufacturing base in China that's been underway for some time, because China is no longer the best place necessarily to produce, say, shoes and toys and textiles. But it's more than just the cost of labor in China. There's also supply chains. And I think most of your member companies are producing in China to sell in China. And that story remains really strong. And then, as I mentioned before, last year, China's share of global exports hit an all-time high. So I think that China still remains an important and reliable part of global supply chains through COVID. In terms of self-reliance and decoupling, this is a really interesting kind of chicken and an egg question. And when you answer it, it kind of reveals how you feel about US-China relations overall, right? Is China talking about self-reliance and decoupling and building up their own semiconductor industry because they want to retreat from the world? Or are they doing that because they feel that the world is threatening them with walls and barriers? You know, my view is it's a mix of those things, but I also think that the biggest factor here is that they view the world, especially the United States, as an increasingly unreliable partner. That companies are eager to do business there, but many in the US government are not so keen on that. And as long as that's the message that's being communicated, even if the Biden administration says that they're only limiting certain transfers of technology or certain shipments of certain goods, I think the message is being perceived in China that this is an effort to hinder China's rise, to trip them up rather than just compete with them. And therefore, it's only logical for them to think about providing more on the domestic side.
Yeah, Andy, another question from a longtime American resident in Beijing who knows the business climate very, very well. compliments you, says you've nailed it on the economy. Would it be more helpful to consider the real estate market by location rather than a monolithic average? Is oversupply localized? Also, does the China pre-sales model with 3 years of mortgage payments before taking possession come under focus as it is scaring away buyers? Should banks and capital markets taking risk on residential project completion and not individuals staking their entire savings on a concrete box?
Great questions. Yeah, great questions. Yeah, for sure, like in the United States, the residential real estate market in China is very local. But I also think that, we have to think about some of the legends that have been told about local places in China. I don't know, maybe some in the audience remember about a decade ago, 60 Minutes did a big report on the ghost cities of China. And Leslie Stahl went with one of my former colleagues and visited the Zhengdong district of Zhengzhou. And that became the poster child of ghost cities in China. I went back 2 years after 60 Minutes went there. I actually hired a location scout so that we could film it with my video camera in the same places where Leslie Stahl went. And what she showed was empty streets and no activity. And what I found is the place was bustling, and I sat in traffic a lot because the buildings were finished, the subway lines were finished, and people had moved in. But to me, the best indicator that these ghost stories are not very long lasting is that since my visit to Zhengzhou, the average house price in that city has increased by 64%. So yeah, it's local, but we also have to realize that some of these stories are short-term. In terms of pre-sale as the method, it's definitely coming under scrutiny right now. I understand why the Chinese government wanted to go this route. They were nervous about the quality of bank lending. They were nervous that small privately owned developers were the leading force in building new homes in China, but it was hard for them to borrow from the state-controlled banking system. So it was easier for people to get a mortgage and then funnel the money that way. It seemed safer. What I think is really going to come under scrutiny now is how much embezzlement, how much corruption took place with this pre-sale money, because this money is supposed to go into an escrow account, which is supervised by local governments to make sure that the money is only used for the projects that are involved with the mortgage. And my assumption is there's been some problems there. Is this going to lead to a wholesale change? Probably not, because I think the government might be feeling like the alternative might be even riskier. We'll have to see how long it takes them to resolve this. Again, my feeling is the scale of this is small enough that if zero COVID is resolved, then this mortgage protest issue will probably fade away in the next several months.
Andy, there was a couple of things that you said during your presentation that that go against the conventional wisdom. One was that domestic demand drives the economy. My understanding was, and this is partially a COVID phenomenon, is that household spending as a percentage of GDP was down to 38%, and savings was way up. And that's not driving an economy, but maybe that's COVID, but maybe it's not. I'm not sure. And you also said that net exports contributed zero to economic growth. And I just wanted to check that because net exports are large and they had been growing. I don't think in the second or third quarter they'll grow, but they had been growing. So is not domestic demand under delivering and net exports an important engine of economic growth? What do I have wrong there?
Well, you have nothing wrong. It's just which time frame we focus on. So in my opening remarks, what I said was that in the 5 years before COVID, on average each year, net exports contributed zero to China's GDP growth. That has changed significantly in the last couple of years, both because exports have been booming, for COVID-related issues in the US and elsewhere. Our factories were closed when China's factories were open, for example. Up until very recently, demand in the United States was really, really strong for many of the goods made in China. Work from home contributed to that for a long period of time. And as you noted, because of the Omicron issues this year, the domestic demand story has been weakened considerably. So right now we're in an anomaly where domestic demand is weaker, exports are stronger. But if China returns to a more pragmatic, balanced approach to COVID, then I think we'll see the structure of the Chinese economy go back to where it was prior to COVID in 2019, with net exports gradually going back to a zero contribution to GDP growth and the domestic demand drivers picking steam back up again. So I'm assuming that these things that you highlighted are temporary as a result of what's happening with the COVID lockdowns, fear of COVID lockdowns.
Yeah, let's hope so. We need the Chinese consumer to feel robust and energetic and to really open their purse strings.
Exactly. I mean, one of the things that everybody in Washington who feels that China is a threat, is an enemy, is not a contributor to our life needs to remember is, again, that on average, every year for the last 10 years, China has accounted for about a third of global growth. That's a larger share of global growth than from the US, Europe, and Japan combined. So at a time when we're tightening and slowing down, and China is, for the next several quarters at least, going to be one of the few major economies that's going to be easing, do we really want to put more obstacles in the way of that economic recovery?
We want Chinese growth.
Chinese growth is good for all of us.
Absolutely. Could not agree with that more. Andy, we got a number of questions coming in. But let me return for a second to your comments on PCAOB and the agreement between the CSRC and the SEC. And I couldn't agree with you more that that's a pragmatic approach to what was a political problem that bodes very well. Now, you follow this very closely, as I understand that this week, auditors will be traveling to Hong Kong to look at books. What do you expect to happen? Do you expect a great deal of delistings, or do you expect additional listings? Is it going to be some inflow, some outflow, all outflow? What should we look forward to?
Yeah, we have PCAOB is a pretty secretive organization, so they haven't given us exact details, but we're expecting that a team of their inspectors will be arriving in Hong Kong any day now and starting their quarantine before they get to work. What's important to remember is what their job is. These guys are going to inspect the accounting firms that work with Chinese companies that are listed in the United States. So they're not actually inspecting Alibaba or JD.com. They're inspecting the auditors for those firms. And what they're focused on is making sure that the auditors are doing their job. This was written into Sarbanes-Oxley as a way to try and avoid a repeat of Enron, when Enron's accounting firm was given a large share of the blame for what happened at Enron. And most of these accounting firms that they're going to be inspecting are Chinese and Hong Kong branches of the big four American accounting firms. So they're all used to this. The real question, as you alluded to, is political. Is the Chinese government going to get in the way of these inspectors doing their job as required under US law? And this is a law that applies to every company that trades in the US, whether it's a US company or a British company or a Singaporean company. And my view is that the Chinese government would not have signed this agreement last month unless they were fully prepared to cooperate with this. There's nothing in it for them to sign this agreement, have the inspectors arrive, and then not allow them to do their job. And I also know from talking to PCAOB in the past that they were not willing to put inspectors on the plane unless the Chinese government agreed to process, access, transparency that's exactly the same as what they get in all other countries. So I think, things could go wrong, but my base case is that they'll be successful here. I don't think we're going to see any more delistings. You might remember that about a week before this agreement was signed between the two governments, 5 large Chinese state-owned enterprises announced that they were leaving. I think this was probably just a sop to hardliners in China who felt that Chinese companies should be listed in China, not in the United States, for nationalistic reasons. But I don't expect to see more delistings. And I think if these inspections go smoothly, which means they get access as they required under law to get, if these goes smoothly, then I believe there's already a pipeline of a significant number of Chinese companies, especially small entrepreneurial companies in areas like biotech and pharma, that really want to list in the United States because they feel that's a better market for them. And I think that once by the end of the year, PCAOB tells Congress that the conditions have been met, then I think we'll see a significant increase in the number of IPOs from Chinese companies in the US next year.
Well, that's a breath of fresh air. From your lips to God's ears, I hope that that's true. It would be good for everyone.
Especially good for American investors, because, what we've been telling people in Congress and PCAOB and SEC is it's good for American investors to have Chinese companies here, because not only are they subject to the PCAOB audits, but they're subject to all of the SEC rules, the same as US companies. And if they delist here and trade only in Hong Kong, then Americans will follow them to the Hong Kong market, which has less stringent oversight.
Yeah, I noticed that Zurich and London and Frankfurt were going out of their way to roll out a red carpet for Chinese investors as well.
Right. And if we want our capital markets to remain the preeminent capital markets in the world, how are we going to do that without Chinese companies?
Chinese companies should be welcome here, and they need to follow American law.
Exactly. And hopefully what we're seeing is the beginning of a process that will run through the rest of the year, where the PCAOB can confirm that they were able to get the access to transparency they needed, and the Chinese auditors are following the law.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting. What would be your time frame? How long would a PCAOB audit normally last? Is this a week thing per company, and a team of 4 or 5 from the US per company? And do you know how many companies are going to be doing over the next, by the end of the month?
What I was told by people in the US government who were working on this is that they're going to do a blitz into China, that they're going to accomplish work that would normally take several years in the space of 6 months. And this is great because it indicates that PCAOB and the SEC want to make this work as long as the Chinese are willing to follow all the rules that everybody else is following. And so they're probably going to do audits of accounting firms for about 6 or 8 of the 250 or so Chinese companies that are listed in the US, because they don't normally audit every company every year. They're doing a sample. And right now, what the focus is to make sure they're getting the cooperation that they need to do this. So I believe they're going to look for a representative sample. There'll be a few large companies. It appears that Alibaba and JD.com will be among the early ones, and Yum China. And then I expect they'll pick 1 or 2 state-owned enterprises, and they'll probably pick 1 or 2 small, relatively less liquid Chinese companies, so that they inspect a variety of auditors for a variety of kinds of companies, and can then, their plan is to reach a conclusion by the end of this calendar year, so they can go back to Congress and say whether or not these trial inspections have been successful. And if they are, then that stops the clock for the forced delistings, which would otherwise begin in 2024.
Interesting. Okay, Andy, we have 2 additional questions, a lot of questions coming in. Let me throw them both to you, and then please respond as you feel appropriate. Say that your analysis and forecast is pragmatic and objective and sounds positive. I'm curious that in similar discussions, that you may have had with U.S. politicians, were their reactions to your forecasts and analysis? And then another kind of related question: how do you think that the impact of ideological confrontation between China and the United States might affect the Chinese economy?
Great questions. So, I lived in DC off and on for a few years while I was in the State Department. Most of my time was in China. I go back periodically now, and frankly, it's a pretty depressing trip back for me. The last time I was there several months ago, I met with staff for a number of Republican members who work on these issues. And basically the message was that there was no member from either party who was going to look at China the way I'm describing it. And that's quite a change from, let's say, the days when we were struggling with WTO and MFN status, where there were some people who wanted to move ahead with a more constructive approach with China and others who didn't. Now it doesn't seem like there's anybody in that second camp. When I've spoken to people in the administration about this, the general response is, well, you don't know what goes on in our conversations with China. They're just not interested in cooperating. And when I push back and say, well, is it possible because they feel that there's no desire on your part to have a more constructive approach, that gets rejected. Now, obviously, I'm no longer in government-to-government meetings, but maybe the thing that troubles me the most is it seems like there's been a complete shutdown in communication between the two governments. On the civilian side, and maybe even more troubling on the military side. It sounds to me like there's not a lot of give and take, trust building, either on the civilian and military side, and that makes it really hard. And there's blame on both sides here, for sure. But I hold my government to a higher standard than I hold the Chinese government on some of these things, because we are the United States and we're a democracy with the rule of law, and we're supposed to be the adult in the room. And I'm kind of frustrated. Let me give you a more concrete example. If you go back to TPP, which is a word that I guess we're not supposed to say anymore. If you go back to TPP, the Obama administration said China could join, but we're setting the bar really high, so they probably can't get in. This was really helpful because it gave the Chinese government something to aim for. It also meant our allies and partners in the region could join TPP and say to the Chinese, hey, we're not joining something against you. You just need to up your own game. But now with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, we've started out by saying to China, you can't even talk to us about joining. And I think that is counterproductive with China. And I think it's also counterproductive with our allies and partners in the region, who are now going to be forced to say, yeah, I want to join. And now I'm going to tell China, by the way, I do more business with China than I do with the US. Now I'm going to tell them that I'm joining this anti-China coalition. So I really hope we're going to get back to a more constructive approach, because again, China's not going away. And the last part of the question about ideology, I think that we just have to be more pragmatic overall. If we're going to say we're only going to deal with democracies, what kind of democracies? How democratic do they have to be? How strong does the rule of law have to be in those countries? And how susceptible to criticism of our own democratic process here are we going to be when we enter into these conversations? So I'm not saying we should back away from promoting the concept of democracy, but I think we have to be more flexible, because this is, over 1 billion people living in China. And what happens to their lives is really important, not only to them, but also to us. And we should be trying to work with what we have available to us.
Well, Andy Rothman, thank you so very much for a really stimulating discussion. Really appreciate your insights, your research. Your website is wonderful as well. And let's do this again at some point. Very grateful to you. Thank you to everyone in the audience who is with us today. Thank you for everyone who provided great questions. And let's carry on the debate. Thank you all, and have a good evening.
Thanks, Greg.